Ladies and gentlemen, help me to welcome Adrienne Anderson.
Okay, raise of hands, who here in the audience is the middle child in their family? If you're raising your hand, then I'm sure, like myself, you have at least one memory or story from your childhood where you possibly felt forgotten, left behind, or even the black sheep of your family, the notorious middle child syndrome. I myself am the middle of three. My brother Brandon is 5 years older than me, and my sister Asia is 3 years younger. The story I'm about to tell is for all of the Jane Bradys, Stephanie Tanners, and Corey Matthews of the world. The infamous middle child. The year this story takes place is 1994. It's the year my sister Asia was born. I was 3 at the time, and my brother Brandon was 8. Every year since I can remember, we would take trips to Saginaw, Michigan, where my grandma lived, twice a year, every Thanksgiving and once in the summer. My grandma lived in Saginaw, Michigan, as I said. It's a very small town. It's actually so small that the mall was actually called The Mall, and you couldn't go anywhere without running into someone you know. So just like every time we would take these trips, my parents would put us into the family vehicle. At this time, it was this big blue Ford Expedition. It was so big it had 3 rows and felt like a school bus, especially to a 3-year-old. So I was young at the time, so I don't remember all of the parts of this trip, but I do remember little visuals of my baby sister in her car seat blowing bubbles with her spit, and my parents playing jazz music over the radio that I absolutely hated. Every time that we would come up there, my grandma would be waiting on her front porch. She had this white house with green shutters and this white wicker patio furniture, and she would always be sitting there greeting us with a smile. She always had a meal prepared. She always made sure we had something to eat after a long trip. And just like every other time, I'm sure we moved to the TV room afterwards. This time in particular, my parents slipped outside, and a few moments later, they called me outside to meet them. So of course I ran outside, and to my surprise, both my parents were standing there with the most beautiful pink Barbie tricycle that any 3-year-old girl would have lost their mind over. I mean, it had the basket, the little horn, and the tassels. So of course I'm wondering, what did I do to deserve this? It wasn't my birthday. It was nowhere near Christmas. So I must have just been a really good girl, right? Of course, I run down there to the bike, and a few doors down, there was this parking lot where my dad took me in this tricycle. And he puts on my helmet, my elbow pads, and my knee pads, puts me on this bike, and shows me how to work the pedals. In no time at all, I'm sure I'm doing donuts in the parking lot, so much that I'm distracted that I didn't realize that I was the only one left in the parking lot. My father had disappeared. So of course, I'm super attached to my parents at this age, so I'm like panicking. I'm gonna ride back to my grandma's house, and that's when I saw it. That blue Ford Expedition driving down the street past me. So I want you guys to think for a second. A 3-year-old toddler trying to chase down a moving vehicle on a Barbie tricycle. It wasn't gonna happen. So the car gets to the end of the street, it hits the stop sign, turns right, and disappears out of sight. So at this point, I'm panicking. Start to ride back to my grandma's house as fast as I can. I get to the front yard, throw that tricycle down because I'm over it at this point. And I march into my grandma's house, and there she was standing there waiting for me as if she was expecting me. And I probably asked her a million questions at this point. Where did they go? When are they coming back? And why did they not take me? And my grandma, as wonderful as a woman as she was, wasted no time ripping that Band-Aid right off. And she looks at me while I have tears in my eyes, and she says exactly, "Oh, honey, they're not coming back." And so at this point, I'm not going to accept that. I am running around her house looking through every single room in her home and looking for them because I think they must be playing a trick. There's no way they left me. But in reality, the only trick that was played that day was that premeditated bike that my parents got me that they used as a distraction. So I meet my grandma again after realizing that no one else is here in the house. And I probably threw the biggest tantrum that any 3-year-old has ever thrown, so much that my grandma actually turns me around and spanks me. And in the same breath, hugs me and tries to console me as best as she could a 3-year-old. But just like that moment, one year and out the other, all I knew was that I had been abandoned. Which leads me into my year with Grandma. Yes, you heard it, a whole year with my grandma. And before I get into that story, and you think that my parents are the absolute worst people in the world to leave a 3-year-old, I asked them about the incident years later, and they actually had a really good reason. They wanted to make damn sure that I suffered from middle child syndrome. No, actually, my brother was 8 at the time, so he was already in school. My sister, a newborn, and me, 3 years old. And it boiled all down to not being able to afford daycare for both of us. And I think about those really hard times being a parent, having to make those tough decisions, especially my mother. She was in the military, so she always kind of had to make those really hard decisions. And with that being a parent, you have to kind of think about them being in that situation. I asked them about it, and they said they actually saw me pedaling after them. They could see me in the rearview mirror, bawling their eyes out. And I know that my mother actually, it was harder for her than it was for me. So leading into that year, I can actually remember it pretty well. I can remember the good times, and I can also remember the bad. The good times being the first birthday that I can remember. My grandma got me this Pocahontas cake and this Pocahontas dress to match. I can remember us sitting in the living room watching our stories, which were soap operas, General Hospital and One Life to Live. And my grandma really loved wrestling, WWE for some reason. She had this huge crush on Shawn Michaels, the Heartbreak Kid. And I can remember this episode where he was climbing into the ring and the other wrestler grabbed him by his pants and pulled his pants down, his butt came out. And my grandma just lost it, like it's the highlight of her life, I'm sure. I can remember helping her in her garden that she had. Our favorite snack was cucumbers and vinegar. I can kind of almost taste it now. I can remember flipping through scrapbooks of all of her travels. She would follow my mom to all the different places that she was stationed in the military until she developed breathing problems and was not able to follow her anymore. I can remember she had this boat, and she would take me out on boat trips, and we would go fishing, and she was such a strong woman. She was the kind of woman that started her own boat, you know. I can also remember the bad times. I can remember my parents trying to contact me, and after a month of avoiding my own parents' phone calls, my grandma forcing me to sit down and talk to them. And I remember calling my own mother and father, Jeanette and Tim, and I was like, who did I think I was at the time? But yeah, I can remember actually drawing faces on brown paper bags. Those were my friends, and actually carrying around a baby doll that I pretended was my sister, Aja. I can also remember every time I saw a blue car thinking, oh my God, excited about my parents coming back to get me, and that feeling of disappointment, and a little bit of resentment, and then of course, hopelessness. The week before my parents came back to get me, my grandmother told me they were coming, and I can remember thinking, I better be good, because I was thinking at that moment it must have been a punishment, or I did something wrong, and that's why I got left, not understanding the situation. And I remember that day, we were sitting there on that white wicker patio furniture, and that blue car pulled into the driveway. And of course, I'm nervous. My mom steps out of the car, and of course, I run to her, and she holds me, and in that moment, I know that this time I'm not going to be left, that I'm reunited with my family again. I always make fun of them about this moment because I hold it over their head, and especially with my brother and my sister, I always say that I'm more like the more independent or stronger one, but really, my sister Aja is one of the strongest people I know. And my brother Brandon actually just had a baby this year. It's gonna be 1 in August, my niece Aubrey, and he's one of the best dads I've ever known. I think about years later at my grandma's funeral, thinking about that time, how I felt that it was like a punishment, almost a prison sentence to be kept there with my grandma for a whole year. And then as you get older, I'm gonna be 27 this year, you learn as an adult how precious those moments actually are. And that as we're getting older and trying to build our own lives, so are they, so are your parents, and so are your grandparents. And you get less and less time. And I actually feel like it was a gift. I feel special that I was the one that got to spend that year with her. And I hope that her spirit is actually still represented through who I am and the person that she was, which was a very strong and beautiful individual. And I really miss her. On a lighter note, though, I will say that blue SUV, that Ford Expedition that taunted me my entire childhood, when it mysteriously disappeared from the driveway and was replaced with a white SUV Saturn, I can honestly tell you that not one tear was shed that day. Thank you.
One more time for Adrienne Anderson. Fantastic.